Ethan Cole found them on Thanksgiving morning, a woman and a baby, half frozen in his barn, blue-lipped and shaking. He hadn't spoken more than necessary in 8 years, hadn't let anyone past his door since the day he buried his wife. But when the woman whispered, "Please, just until dawn," something in him cracked. He carried the baby inside first, then helped her to the fire. By sunrise, the words had left his mouth before he could stop them. "You can stay." 3 words that would crack open his grief-locked world and force a town to choose between judgment and mercy. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button and stay with us until the end. The November wind cut through Wyoming territory like a broken promise, sharp enough to strip bark from trees and hope from hearts. Ethan Cole moved through it the way he moved through everything now, silent, steady, alone. His boots crunched through snow that had fallen during the night, each step a measured rhythm he'd perfected over 8 years of widowhood. The ranch spread around him in shades of white and gray, beautiful in the way that desolate things sometimes are. He'd learned to prefer the cold. Cold was honest. It didn't pretend to comfort you while it killed you slowly from the inside. The barn door stood slightly ajar, which stopped him mid-stride. He never left it open. Never. His hand went automatically to the rifle he no longer carried, hadn't carried since the day Martha died, and he'd realized that some things you couldn't shoot your way out of. He approached slowly, watching his breath cloud in the freezing air, and pulled the door wider. At first, he thought it was just shadows and hay. Then the shadows moved. She was pressed into the corner, wrapped in what might have once been a coat but now looked more like a collection of rags held together by desperation. Dark hair fell across her face, matted with dirt and ice. But it was the bundle in her arms that made Ethan's heart lurch against his ribs. A baby, maybe 3 months old, wrapped in a blanket so thin he could see the child's chest struggling to rise and fall. The woman's eyes snapped to his, wide and wild as a cornered animal's. Her lips had gone the color of old bruises. "Please." The word came out broken, barely a whisper. "Just until dawn. We'll be gone by dawn, please." Ethan stood frozen, every instinct he'd built over 8 years of solitude screaming at him to turn around, to pretend he'd never opened this door. He'd learned to survive grief by feeling nothing, by letting his heart turn to the same frozen soil he walked on. Letting anyone in meant thawing, and thawing meant pain. But the baby made a sound, not even a cry, just a weak mewling like a kitten drowning, and Ethan's feet moved before his mind caught up. "Give me the child." "No." She pulled back, protective even in her desperation. "Woman, that baby's lips are turning blue. You want to watch her die in a barn? That's your choice. But I've got a fire inside, and you've got about 5 minutes before hypothermia makes your decisions for you." Their eyes locked. Hers were brown, he noticed, the kind of brown that matched creek beds in summer. They held a ferocity that didn't match her starved frame, a mother's mathematics calculating which danger posed less threat. Slowly, she extended the bundle toward him. The baby weighed almost nothing. Ethan cradled her against his chest, feeling the small body's tremors through his coat, and turned toward the house without checking if the woman followed. He heard her stumbling footsteps behind him, the rasp of her breathing too shallow, too fast. The house smelled like cold coffee and older loneliness. Ethan hadn't decorated for Thanksgiving, hadn't acknowledged the holiday in years. What was there to be thankful for when you'd already lost everything that mattered? But the fire still burned in the hearth because he wasn't fool enough to freeze out of spite. And he moved directly to it now, kneeling with the baby. Her face had gone waxy, little fingers curled tight. He unwrapped her carefully, checking for frostbite, and found her dressed in nothing but a thin nightgown and a diaper made from what looked like torn petticoat. Rage moved through him, clean and sharp. What kind of world put babies out in November cold? The woman collapsed into the chair behind him. He heard her teeth chattering, a violent rhythm that shook her whole frame. "There's a blanket on the back of the couch," Ethan said, not looking up from the baby. "Wrap yourself in it. Then get over here by the fire before you pass out." He heard rustling, the shuffle of frozen feet on wood floor. When she knelt beside him, he caught the smell of her. Unwashed, yes, but underneath that, something like sage and desperation. She reached for the baby, and he let her take the child, watching as she curled around her daughter with such fierce tenderness it hurt to witness. "How long have you been out there?" he asked. "I don't—" Her voice cracked. "Days. Maybe a week. I lost track. You got a name?" "Lena." She looked at him properly for the first time, and he saw the bruise along her jaw, faded to yellow-green but unmistakable. "This is Mila." Ethan stood, moving to the stove. His hands went through the motions of coffee making automatically while his mind tried to catch up with what he'd just done. 8 years. 8 years of keeping the world at arm's length, of speaking only to shopkeepers and ranch hands when absolutely necessary, of building walls so high even memory couldn't climb them. And now there was a woman and baby in his house on Thanksgiving morning. "You running from someone?" He poured coffee into 2 cups, both chipped at the rim because he'd stopped caring about things like that. Lena's silence was answer enough. He brought the coffee to her, set it within reach. She stared at it like he'd offered her gold. "Drink it slow, your stomach's probably empty." "I can't." She looked up at him, and he saw tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. "I can't pay you. I don't have anything." "Did I ask for payment?" Men always want something. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with history he didn't want to imagine. Ethan crouched down so they were eye level, careful to keep distance between them. "What I want is for that baby not to die in my barn. Past that, I'm not asking anything from you except that you drink the coffee before it gets cold." She studied him with those creek-bed eyes, looking for the lie, the trap, the price that would come due later. Whatever she found in his face must have satisfied her because she finally reached for the cup with shaking hands. The coffee was terrible. He'd never learned to make it right after Martha died, and spite had kept him from trying. But Lena drank it like sacrament. Color started returning to her lips, though her hand still trembled around the warm ceramic. Mila began to fuss, a weak sound that reminded Ethan of birds with broken wings. "She's hungry," Lena said, and shame colored her voice. "I haven't been able to feed her properly. There's not enough." She trailed off, but Ethan understood. Starvation had taken her milk. He stood, moving to the kitchen with purpose now. "I've got goat's milk. It's what we use for orphaned calves this time of year." He pulled out a bottle, measuring carefully. "It'll do until we figure something better." "We?" The word came out small, disbelieving. Ethan stopped, the bottle half full in his hand. "We." He'd said "we." He hadn't used that word since Martha's funeral, when the preacher had said, "We commit her body to the ground," and Ethan had wanted to punch God himself. "For now," he said gruffly, not looking at her. "Just for now." He warmed the milk slowly, testing it against his wrist the way Martha used to with their... No, he wouldn't go down that path. When he brought the bottle to Lena, her hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. Without a word, he knelt beside her and took Mila, positioning the baby in the crook of his arm with a muscle memory that made his chest ache. Mila latched onto the bottle with desperate hunger, her small throat working. Lena watched him feed her daughter, and something shifted in her expression. The wariness didn't leave, but wonder crept in beside it. "You've done this before," she said softly. "Long time ago." "You have children?" "Had." The word came out flat, final. "She was 2 months old when the fever took her. Took my wife 3 days later." Silence settled over them, broken only by Mila's hungry suckling and the snap of the fire. Ethan kept his eyes on the baby, watching her small face relax as warmth and food worked through her system. Her fingers uncurled slowly, tiny pink starfish against his work-roughened hand. "I'm sorry," Lena whispered. "It was 8 years ago." Grief doesn't care about time. He looked at her then, really looked. She couldn't be more than 25, but her eyes held decades. The bruise on her jaw was just the most recent mark. He could see the faint white lines of old scars on her hands, the careful way she held her left shoulder like it had been damaged and never properly healed. "The man you're running from," Ethan said. "He the father?" Lena's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "He's nobody's father, just a man who thought ownership came with a wedding ring. He'll come looking?" "Maybe. Probably. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. That's why we'll leave at dawn, like I said. I won't bring trouble to your door. Woman, you showed up half frozen in my barn with a starving baby. Trouble's already here. He shifted Mila to burp her, the motion automatic. Question is what we do about it. There is no we. But her voice lacked conviction now, undermined by the warmth seeping back into her bones and the sight of her daughter finally feeding. Ethan stood, settling Mila against his shoulder and patting her back gently. The baby let out a small burp, and he felt the tiniest flutter of something that might have been satisfaction. It's Thanksgiving, he said. Nearest town is 10 miles. Snow's coming. I can smell it. You go out there now, you'll be dead before sunset, both of you. Then I'll wait until tomorrow. Storm's going to last 3 days at least. He looked out the window at the gray-white sky. And even after it clears, you're in no shape to travel. Look at yourself. Lena glanced down at her hands, bone-thin, nails broken, skin raw from cold and deprivation. He watched her try to summon defiance and find only exhaustion. Why would you help us? The question came out broken. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, where I've been. Don't need to. Ethan returned Mila to her arms, careful with the transfer. All I need to know is there's a baby who needs shelter and a mother who needs food. Past that isn't my business unless you make it my business. Lena stared at him, and he saw the exact moment her last defense crumbled. She bent over Mila, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that she tried desperately to muffle. Ethan turned away, giving her what privacy he could in the small room. He moved to the kitchen and started pulling out food. Bread, butter, dried meat, a jar of preserves Mrs. Hendricks had brought by last month despite his protests. His hands worked while his mind reeled. What was he doing? 8 years of careful isolation, demolished in a single morning. 8 years of teaching his heart to stay frozen, melted by a woman who wouldn't look at him and a baby who fit in the palm of his hand. But when he turned back and saw Lena trying to eat bread one-handed while holding Mila, trying to make herself smaller in the chair like she was afraid of taking up too much space, something in him settled. There's a room, he heard himself say. It was going to be a nursery. I haven't opened it in 8 years, but the bed's still there. You can stay there. Both of you. I can't. You can, and you will. His voice came out harder than he intended. I'm not debating this. You're staying at least until the storm passes and you've got strength back. After that, you do what you need to do. But I'm not sending a woman and baby out into a November blizzard. Lena looked at him for a long moment, searching for the trap, the price, the inevitable betrayal. He let her look, keeping his face as neutral as he could manage. Finally, she nodded. Just a small dip of her chin, but it felt like surrender and trust and terror all mixed together. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan grunted and turned back to the stove, uncomfortable with gratitude. Storm's going to hit by nightfall. I need to check the livestock, make sure everything's secured. There's more food in the pantry. Help yourself. The room's upstairs, first door on the left. Linens are in the closet. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, needing space, needing cold air to clear his head. But he paused at the threshold, looking back. Lena had stood, holding Mila against her chest, looking around the room like she couldn't quite believe it was real. The firelight caught in her hair, turning it bronze and copper, and for just a moment she looked like something other than a desperate woman running from devils. She looked like hope, fragile and hard-won. Lena, he said, and she turned. That room hasn't been opened in 8 years. It's going to need airing out, and there's probably dust everywhere. But the lock's on the inside, not the outside, you understand? Her eyes widened slightly, understanding the gift he was offering, safety, autonomy, the ability to lock him out if she needed to. I understand, she said softly. Ethan nodded once and stepped out into the cold. The barn work took 3 hours. Ethan moved through it methodically, checking each animal, distributing feed, reinforcing the doors against the coming storm. His hands worked while his mind tried to make sense of what he'd done. He'd let them in. After 8 years of keeping everyone at arm's length, of perfecting the art of being alone, he'd opened his door to strangers, to complications, to the possibility of loss all over again. The goats bleated at him, warm and content in their stalls. He'd built this place into a fortress against feeling, and in one morning, a half-frozen woman and her baby had breached the walls without even trying. When he finally returned to the house, the sun was setting in that particular way that meant snow within hours. He stomped his boots clean and pushed the door open quietly, half expecting to find them gone. A hallucination brought on by too much solitude and the ghost of Thanksgiving past. But the house smelled different, smelled like old soup. He followed his nose to the kitchen and found Lena at the stove, stirring a pot with one hand while Mila slept in a makeshift nest of blankets in the corner. She'd found his root vegetables and the dried meat and somehow created something that actually smelled edible. "You didn't have to," he started. "I did." She didn't turn around. "You gave us shelter. Least I can do is make myself useful." That wasn't the deal. There wasn't a deal. Now she did look at him, and he saw steel beneath the exhaustion. "But I'm not a charity case, Mr. Cole. If I'm staying, even for a few days, I'll earn my keep. It's just Ethan." Ethan. She tested his name, and it sounded strange in her voice, careful, like she was learning a new language. "The soup's ready. I wasn't sure if you'd eaten today." He hadn't. Couldn't remember the last time he'd bothered with a proper meal on Thanksgiving. Usually, he just worked until exhaustion made him too tired to remember what day it was. They ate in silence, sitting at opposite ends of the table. The soup was good, better than anything Ethan had made for himself in years. Lena ate slowly, forcing herself to small portions even though he could see the hunger in her eyes. "There's more," he said. "You should eat more." "I shouldn't. My stomach's been empty too long. Too much too fast, and I'll just get sick." "You know a lot about starving." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "You learn things when you're desperate. How to make nothing last, how to keep moving when your body wants to quit, how to tell which barns might have hay soft enough to sleep in without the owner coming out with a shotgun." Ethan set down his spoon carefully. "How long have you been on the road?" "Since summer. Since I realized that if I stayed, one day Thomas would hit me hard enough that I wouldn't get back up, and Mila would grow up watching her mother get smaller and smaller until there was nothing left." "Thomas, that's his name?" "Thomas Bennett. Works at the mill in Sheridan. Respectable, church-going." Her voice turned brittle. "Everyone loved him. When I tried to tell people what he was like behind closed doors, they looked at me like I was crazy, said I should be grateful a man like him wanted a woman like me." "A woman like you," Ethan repeated flatly. Lena's hand went unconsciously to her midsection, and he understood. She'd been pregnant when she married. Society's judgment had trapped her as surely as Thomas's fists. "I don't need to know your history," he said. "Yes, you do." She met his eyes directly. "Because you need to understand what kind of trouble you're inviting by letting us stay. Thomas has friends, he has money, and he has a very particular idea about what belongs to him. You're not property. The law doesn't always agree." She stood, gathering the dishes. "I've heard stories about men like him hiring bounty hunters to track down runaway wives. About judges who send women back to their husbands no matter what they claim happened. I won't let that happen to Mila. I won't let her grow up thinking that's what love looks like." Ethan watched her move around his kitchen, this fierce, broken woman who'd walked through November cold with a baby rather than stay somewhere safe but cruel. She washed the dishes in water she heated on the stove, her movements efficient despite her obvious exhaustion. "The room," he said. "You looked at it yet?" "I didn't want to presume. Go look. I'll finish these." She hesitated, then dried her hands and climbed the stairs slowly. Ethan heard the door open, heard her sharp intake of breath. He'd left it exactly as it was the day Martha died. The cradle sat in the corner, hand-carved from oak, the rocking chair by the window where Martha would have nursed their daughter, the pale yellow curtain she'd sewn herself, imagining spring sunshine and a baby's laughter. When Lena came back down, her eyes were red. "I can't," she started. "You can. Ethan, that room hasn't been used in 8 years and won't be used for another 80 if you don't take it." He turned to face her. "I'm not keeping it as a shrine. I'm just keeping it because I'm too stubborn to admit I need to let go. So do us both a favor and use it." She stood on the stairs, haloed by lamplight, and he saw her make a decision, saw her decide to trust, just a little, just enough. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." That night, as the first snow began to fall, Ethan lay in his own bed and listened to the sounds of other people in his house. Lena's footsteps above him, soft and careful. Mila's tiny cries, quickly soothed. The creak of the rocking chair as Lena settled in to nurse her daughter with the goat's milk. His house breathed differently with them in it. Less like a tomb, more like a place where people actually lived. He told himself it was temporary. Told himself that as soon as the storm passed and Lena regained her strength, they'd leave and his life would return to its familiar frozen rhythm. Told himself he wouldn't get attached, wouldn't let himself care, wouldn't make the mistake of hoping for something more. But in the darkness, with snow falling soft against the windows and the ghost of baby sounds drifting through his ceiling, Ethan Cole began to suspect he'd already lost that particular battle. He'd opened the door, and some doors, once opened, could never quite close the same way again. The storm hit full force by midnight, wind howling like all the loneliness in the world given voice. Ethan lay awake and listened to it rage against the walls he'd built, both the wood ones that sheltered them and the invisible ones around his heart. Upstairs, Lena sang softly to Mila, a melody he didn't recognize in a language that sounded like homesickness and hope tangled together. And for the first time in 8 years, Ethan's house felt less like a place where things had ended and more like a place where something new, fragile, terrifying, and utterly unexpected might be beginning. The storm kept them inside for 3 days, just as Ethan had predicted. Snow piled against the windows in drifts that reached halfway up the glass, turning the world beyond into a blur of white and gray. The wind never stopped, a constant presence that made the house creak and settle like an old ship riding out rough seas. On the first morning, Ethan woke to the smell of coffee, real coffee, properly made, and found Lena already in the kitchen. She moved quietly, trying not to wake him, measuring grounds with the careful precision of someone who understood that waste was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You didn't have to," he said from the doorway, and she startled, nearly dropping the pot. "I couldn't sleep." She kept her eyes on the stove. "And you've been kind. Least I can do is make decent coffee." He grunted and moved to the table, watching her work. She'd found his wife's old apron in the pantry, pale blue with yellow flowers, and the sight of it on someone else's frame should have hurt. Instead, it just looked right somehow, like the apron had been waiting all these years to be useful again. Lena poured 2 cups and brought them to the table, sitting at the far end like she had the night before. The coffee was perfect, strong and hot, with none of the bitterness that characterized his own attempts. "Martha tried to teach me," he said, staring into his cup. "How to make it right. I never could get the proportions down. After she died, I figured coffee was supposed to taste like punishment anyway." "It's just practice and paying attention." Lena wrapped her hands around her own cup. "My mother worked in a hotel kitchen. She said coffee was the difference between a customer who tipped and one who complained. So she taught me young." "She's still alive? Your mother?" "Died when I was 16. Pneumonia." Lena's voice went flat in the way that meant old grief, the kind you'd learn to carry without letting it crush you. "My father lasted another year before the drink finished what sorrow started. I was working at that same hotel when Thomas came through on business." She fell silent, and Ethan didn't push. They drank their coffee while outside the wind threw snow against the walls like it was trying to bury them alive. "I need to check the animals," he said finally. "Storm's bad, but they'll need feeding. Can I help?" He looked at her properly. Still too thin, still moving like her ribs hurt when she breathed too deep, exhaustion written in the shadows under her eyes. "You can help by staying warm and keeping that baby fed. I'll manage the barn." For a moment he thought she'd argue, but she just nodded, accepting the boundary he'd drawn. "Be careful. That wind sounds mean." "Wind's always mean in Wyoming. You just learn to walk through it anyway." He bundled up in his heavy coat and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a fist, stealing his breath. He'd rigged a rope from the house to the barn years ago for exactly this reason, and he followed it now with his head down, fighting for each step. The animals were restless, sensing the storm's violence. He fed them methodically, checking each one, speaking in low tones that got lost in the wind's roar. The work settled him, gave him something to do with his hands while his mind tried to process the changes happening in his house. 3 days. She'd said they'd stay 3 days until the storm passed. Then she'd leave, and his life would return to its accustomed emptiness. The goats pressed against him, warm and solid. One of them, Matilda, the oldest, bumped her head against his leg insistently until he scratched behind her ears. "Yeah, I know," he muttered. "I'm an idiot, getting attached to strays. You'd think I'd learn." Matilda just chewed her cud and looked at him with those unsettling horizontal pupilled eyes that seemed to see right through his defenses. When he fought his way back to the house, he found Lena standing at the window with Mila in her arms, watching for him. Relief crossed her face when he stumbled through the door, and something in his chest twisted at the sight of it. "I was worried," she said simply. "Takes more than a November storm to kill me. Been walking that rope line for 8 years. Still." She shifted Mila higher on her shoulder. "It's good to have someone come back." The words hung between them, weighted with all the times people hadn't come back for her, all the times she'd been left to manage alone. Ethan shrugged out of his coat and moved to the fire, holding his frozen hands out to the heat. "You eat yet?" "I waited. Wasn't sure if you'd want breakfast or if you eat later." "Lena." He turned to look at her. "You don't have to ask permission to eat food in this house. You're hungry. You eat. Mila needs something. You take it. I'm not going to keep score." She bit her lip, and he saw how hard it was for her to accept that. How many times had Thomas made her account for every scrap, every moment, every breath? "Old habits," she said quietly. "He used to check the pantry. Make sure I hadn't taken more than my share." Ethan felt rage move through him, clean and cold. "Your share. In your own house. His house, his money, his rules." She rocked Mila gently. "I learned early that it was easier to go without than to deal with his anger when he thought I was being wasteful." "He starve you?" "Not exactly. He just made sure I understood that everything I had was because he allowed it. Food, clothes, the roof over my head, all his generosity, all conditional on my good behavior." Ethan had heard stories like this before. The ranchers talked sometimes about men who treated their wives like livestock, breaking them with calculated cruelty until they forgot they'd ever been wild. He'd always figured it was exaggeration, the kind of tale that grew in the telling. Looking at Lena now, he knew better. "Make breakfast," he said. "Whatever you want. And make enough for 2 people who've been working, not 2 people trying to disappear." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but close. "Yes, sir." "And stop calling me sir. I'm Ethan." "Ethan." She said it softer this time, like she was tasting the shape of his name. "Eggs and bacon? I found both in the cold box." "Sounds perfect." They fell into a rhythm over the next 2 days that felt dangerous in its domesticity. Ethan would wake to coffee already made, to Lena moving quietly through the kitchen like a ghost learning to be solid again. They'd eat breakfast together at opposite ends of the table, speaking little but learning each other's silences. He'd tend the animals while she cleaned the house, touching things that hadn't been touched in years. She didn't ask permission, just moved through the rooms like she was trying to earn her keep, polishing until the old wood gleamed in the windows, what could be seen of them through the snow, let in pale winter light. In the afternoons, while Mila slept, Lena would sit by the fire with mending. She'd found his collection of shirts with missing buttons and torn seams, the pile of socks that needed darning, and she worked through them with steady patience. "You don't have to do that," Ethan said on the second day, looking up from the harness he was repairing. "I know." She didn't look up from her stitching. "But idle hands make me nervous. Thomas used to—" She stopped, shook her head. "Never mind." "Used to what?" Lena's hand stilled on the fabric. "He'd come home and check, make sure I'd been productive. If the house wasn't clean enough, if dinner wasn't ready, if I'd spent too much time with Mila instead of working, he'd—" Her voice went tight. He had ways of showing his disappointment. Ethan set down the harness. "Lena, you don't owe me work. You don't owe me anything. I owe you my life. Both our lives." She met his eyes, and hers were fierce. "Do you know what would have happened if you hadn't found us?" We'd be dead in that barn, frozen solid. Just another tragedy people would tisk about over Sunday dinner before forgetting we ever existed. Maybe. Or maybe someone else would have found you. We'd been walking for 3 days before we got to your ranch. You know how many barns I tried? How many times someone ran me off with threats and dogs and once with a shotgun? She stabbed her needle through the fabric with more force than necessary. You're the first person who looked at me like I was human instead of vermin. The words settled heavy in the room. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the fire crackled and Mila made small sleeping sounds from her nest of blankets. World's a hard place, Ethan said finally, especially for women on their own. World's a hard place for anyone who doesn't fit in the boxes people make. Lena's voice went quiet. I was supposed to be grateful. Grateful Thomas wanted me even though I was pregnant with another man's baby. Grateful he gave me his name. Grateful he provided for us. The baby's father died before I knew I was carrying. She smoothed the fabric in her lap. He was a ranch hand passing through. We had 2 weeks together before he got hired on somewhere in Montana. He wrote once, said he'd send for me when he got settled. Then nothing. I found out later he got trampled by a horse 3 days after he left. I'm sorry. I'm not. Her voice was steady. Those 2 weeks were the only time in my life I felt chosen instead of settled for. And Mila, she glanced at her sleeping daughter. She's the one pure thing I have. The one choice I made that was completely mine. Ethan understood that. The fierce love of a parent for a child, the way it could sustain you through anything. He'd felt it for his own daughter in her brief 2 months of life, a love so consuming it had nearly destroyed him when she died. She looks like you, he said. Got your eyes. Lena smiled, a real smile this time. You think? I keep looking for pieces of her father, but all I see is myself looking back. That's not a bad thing. No. Her hands resumed their stitching. No, I suppose it's not. That night, after Lena had gone upstairs with Mila, Ethan sat alone by the fire and tried to convince himself this was still temporary. Tried to remember all the reasons why he couldn't let himself care, couldn't let himself hope, couldn't let himself imagine what it might be like if they stayed. But the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt lived in, warm, like something that had been sleeping for 8 years was slowly waking up. Upstairs he heard Lena singing to Mila, that same melody from the first night, soft and sweet and heartbreaking. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him, this evidence of life continuing, of mothers loving daughters, of tenderness surviving cruelty. The storm broke on the 4th morning. Ethan woke to silence. Not the dead silence of isolation, but the peaceful quiet that comes after violence passes. No wind, no snow rattling the windows, just pale sunlight filtering through gaps in the drifts. He found Lena already awake, staring out the kitchen window at the transformed landscape. Everything had been buried and remade, familiar landmarks turned strange under layers of white. It's beautiful, she said softly. Terrible, but beautiful. Wyoming specializes in that. He moved to stand beside her, careful to maintain distance. Beautiful things that can kill you if you're not careful. Like most beautiful things, I suppose. She glanced at him, then away. The storm's over. We should probably think about moving on. There it was, the conversation he'd been dreading. You got a destination in mind? He asked. West, maybe. Oregon or California. Somewhere far enough that Thomas won't think to look. Her hands twisted together. I've got some money saved, not much, but enough to buy passage on a wagon train come spring. Spring's 4 months away. I know. Her voice went small. I'll figure something out. Maybe find work in town, stay in a boarding house. With what money? You just said you're saving everything for spring. I'll manage. I always do. Ethan stared out at the snow, at the impossible distance between his barn and the road, at the world that would swallow this woman and her baby without a second thought. Or, he heard himself say, you could stay. Lena went very still beside him. Ethan, just until spring. Like you said, that's when the wagon trains leave anyway. Stay here, save your money, let Mila get stronger. He kept his eyes on the window, afraid to look at her. I've got the room. Got food enough for 3. And winter's a bad time to be traveling with a baby. You don't owe us anything. I know that. Then why? Now he did look at her, this fierce, broken woman who'd walked through hell with a baby in her arms. Because this house is too damn quiet. Because I'm tired of eating my own bad cooking. Because that room upstairs was meant for a child and it's been empty too long. He paused. And because I think maybe we could help each other. You need a safe place to winter. He stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. What did he need? Company? Purpose? A reason to make good coffee and fix the broken step on the porch and care whether he lived or died? All of the above, probably. Lena studied him with those creek-bed eyes, looking for the trap again. What would people say? A woman and a man, not married, living under one roof? Since when do you care what people say? Since I have a daughter whose reputation might matter someday. But her voice lacked heat. And since you have to live in this town after we leave, I won't ruin you for showing us kindness. Ethan laughed, a rusty sound. Lena, I'm a widower who hasn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone in 8 years. My reputation's already ruined by sheer orneriness. Nothing you could do would make it worse. You don't know that. I know that I'm making you an offer, a business arrangement, if you want to call it that. You help around the house, I provide shelter and food until spring. Then you go west like you planned, and I go back to being a hermit. He crossed his arms. Clean, simple. No obligations past April. She wanted to say yes. He could see it in the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, in the hope that flickered across her face before she tamped it down. I'd need to work, she said. Really work. Not just cooking and cleaning. I could help with the animals, the ranch chores. You ever worked a ranch before? No, but I can learn. I'm strong, stronger than I look right now, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Ethan considered her. She was still too thin, still moving like her body hurt, but there was steel in her spine that no amount of abuse had managed to break. All right, he said, but we do this smart. You build your strength back first, put some weight on those bones. Can't work a ranch if you collapse from exhaustion halfway through feeding the chickens. I won't collapse. You will if you don't eat properly and rest when you need to. He softened his voice. Lena, you've been surviving for months. Now you can stop just surviving and actually recover. Let yourself do that. Her eyes got bright, and she turned away quickly, swiping at her face. I'm not used to people being reasonable. Yeah, well, don't get too comfortable. I'm still ornery as hell and my moods are unpredictable. He moved toward the door. I need to dig out the barn. You make us some breakfast, and we'll talk details after. Ethan? She caught his arm as he passed, her hand light on his sleeve. Thank you. Really. I don't know how to... I can't... Don't thank me yet. You haven't experienced a Wyoming winter locked in with a grumpy widower. He patted her hand awkwardly. Ask me again in April if you still think this was a good idea. He escaped outside before she could say anything else, before the gratitude in her eyes could undo him completely. The snow came up past his knees, pristine and blinding in the morning sun. He grabbed the shovel and started digging toward the barn, letting the physical work settle his racing thoughts. What had he just done? Invited a stranger to stay for 4 months? Committed to sharing his space, his solitude, his carefully constructed defenses against feeling anything at all. But when he looked back at the house and saw Lena's silhouette in the window with Mila in her arms, both of them outlined in warm light, something in his chest that had been frozen for 8 years cracked just a little wider. Maybe this was a mistake. Probably was, if he was being honest. But maybe some mistakes were worth making. He dug until his shoulders ached and sweat froze on his face, until the path to the barn was clear and the animals could see daylight again. When he finally trudged back to the house, he found the table set for 2 and the smell of bacon filling the air. Lena had found his wife's good plates, the ones he hadn't used since the funeral. She'd put them out like this was something special, something worth marking. Seemed like the occasion called for it, she said, catching his expression. New arrangements deserve new beginnings, don't they? Ethan hung up his coat and moved to the table. The food was arranged carefully, more care than he'd seen in a meal in years. Lena sat down across from him, and for the first time she didn't choose the far end of the table. She sat close enough that they could pass dishes easily, close enough that this felt like sharing instead of coexisting. To spring, she said, raising her coffee cup. To spring, Ethan echoed, and they drank to the future, hers heading west, his returning to solitude, and the 4 months between that suddenly felt both too long and not nearly long enough. The arrangement lasted exactly 3 weeks before the town found out. Ethan had known it was coming. In a place as small as theirs, secrets had a way of traveling faster than good sense. He'd hoped for more time, maybe through Christmas at least, but hope had never been his strong suit anyway. It was Mrs. Henderson who spotted them first, coming out of the general store with Lena carrying Mila and Ethan walking beside them with supplies. The older woman's eyes went wide, then narrow, her mouth pinching into a line that spoke volumes before she'd said a word. "Ethan Cole," she said, her voice carrying across the street like a judgment. "I heard rumors, but I didn't believe them. You've got a woman living in your house?" Ethan felt Lena stiffen beside him, felt her start to shrink back into that smaller version of herself. He stepped forward instead, putting himself between Mrs. Henderson's glare and Lena's fear. "I've got guests staying through the winter," he said evenly. "Don't see how that's anyone's business but mine." "Guests." Mrs. Henderson's laugh was sharp. "Is that what we're calling it now? A young woman, unmarried, living under your roof without a chaperone? Ethan, what would Martha think?" The mention of his wife's name was calculated to wound, and it did. But Ethan had spent 8 years building armor against pain, and he didn't flinch. "Martha would think I did the right thing finding a woman and baby half frozen in my barn and giving them shelter, same as she'd expect any decent person to do. Shelter is one thing, cohabitation is quite another." Mrs. Henderson's eyes raked over Lena, taking in her shabby dress, the baby in her arms, the way she held herself like she expected a blow. "We have standards in this community, Christian standards." "Funny how those Christian standards don't seem to include charity or compassion," Ethan said, and his voice had gone cold now, the kind of cold that made ranch hands step back. "Last I checked, turning away someone in need wasn't exactly biblical behavior." "Don't you dare lecture me about—" "Ma'am." Lena's voice cut through, quiet but steady. She'd straightened her spine, lifted her chin. "I'm sorry if my presence offends you, but Mr. Cole has been nothing but honorable. He's provided shelter during the winter, that's all. Come spring, I'll be moving on." Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "Moving on? Yes, I'm sure you will be, once you've gotten whatever you came for." The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Ethan felt rage move through him, hot and sharp, but Lena's hand on his arm stopped him from saying something he might regret. "We should go," she murmured. "The supplies—" "We're going," Ethan agreed. He looked at Mrs. Henderson one last time. "You want to judge me? That's your right. But you come after her or that baby again, we're going to have a problem. Understood?" He didn't wait for an answer. He guided Lena toward the wagon, loaded the supplies with more force than necessary, and drove them out of town without looking back. The silence stretched between them for the first mile. Lena held Mila close, her face turned toward the window, and Ethan could see her shoulders trembling despite her efforts to control them. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I've ruined you, just like I said I would." "You haven't ruined anything. She'll tell everyone. By Sunday, the whole town will know. They'll—" Her voice cracked. "They'll make your life hell, and it's my fault." Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop. They were halfway between town and the ranch, surrounded by nothing but snow and sky, and the kind of silence that made you hear your own heartbeat. "Lena, look at me." She turned slowly, and he saw tears tracking down her face, despite her obvious effort to hold them back. "I don't give a damn what Mrs. Henderson thinks. I don't give a damn what the whole town thinks." He kept his voice steady, willing her to believe him. "I stopped caring about their opinions 8 years ago when they came to Martha's funeral and told me it was part of some divine plan. There's no plan that takes a 2-month-old baby and her mother. There's just random cruelty, and we either stand against it or we become part of it. But your reputation? My reputation is that I'm a mean old bastard who doesn't talk to anyone. That's not changing whether you're at my ranch or not." He reached over and gently wiped a tear from her cheek, the gesture surprising them both. "You're staying. We agreed through spring, and I keep my agreements. Everything else is just noise. Lena stared at him, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, that was still too fragile, but something close. Belief, maybe, that he meant what he said. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." They drove the rest of the way in easier silence, but Ethan knew the damage was done. By Sunday, the whole town would be talking, and talking in small towns had a way of becoming action. He was right. The delegation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after the encounter with Mrs. Henderson. Ethan was in the barn when he heard the horses, and something cold settled in his gut when he saw who'd come. Pastor Williams led them, a good man generally, but weak when it came to standing against his congregation's worst impulses. Behind him rode Tom Morrison, the mayor, and Jacob Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's husband, and the closest thing the town had to a moral authority. Ethan met them in the yard, arms crossed, face neutral. Behind him, he heard the house door open, heard Lena step onto the porch. "Gentlemen," he said, "wasn't expecting company." Pastor Williams had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Ethan, we need to talk. Could we come inside?" "No." The bluntness made Morrison frown. "Now see here, Cole. We've ridden all this way, and you can state your business from right there." Ethan didn't move. "I'm guessing this isn't a social call." Jacob Henderson leaned forward in his saddle, his expression stern. "It's about the woman and the impropriety of your situation. The woman has a name. It's Lena, and there's nothing improper about providing shelter to someone in need." "Shelter, yes. But Ethan, she's been living here for weeks now. A young woman, unmarried, with a child of questionable—" Henderson paused delicately. "Of questionable origins." Behind him, Ethan heard Lena's sharp intake of breath. He felt his hands curl into fists and forced them to relax. "Careful," he said softly. "Very careful how you finish that sentence." Pastor Williams raised a placating hand. "No one's trying to insult anyone, Ethan, but you have to understand how this looks. The community has standards, expectations. For both your sakes, this arrangement needs to end. For both our sakes." Ethan let the words hang there. "Funny how you're so concerned about my reputation now, when none of you gave a damn about checking on me for 8 years. "That's not fair," Morrison started. "Isn't it? When's the last time any of you rode out here? When's the last time you asked if I needed anything, if I was managing?" He looked at each of them in turn. "You left me alone to rot in my grief because it was easier than dealing with an angry widower. Now suddenly you care about my welfare." "We care about the community's moral standards," Henderson said stiffly, "and about that woman's soul. Living in sin." "We're not living in sin." Ethan's voice cut like a blade. "She's a guest in my house. She helps with chores in exchange for room and board. That's all." "That's all." Morrison shook his head. "Ethan, even if nothing untoward is happening, and I'm not saying it is, the appearance alone is damaging. To you, to her, to that child. Then maybe the problem is with people who assume the worst instead of believing the truth." "The truth is subjective," Henderson said. "Propriety is not. The solution is simple. The woman needs to leave." "No." The word dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. The 3 men exchanged glances, and Ethan saw them shifting from persuasion to something harder. "Ethan," Pastor Williams tried again, his voice gentle. "Think about what's best for everyone involved. We can help her find appropriate lodging. There's a boarding house in town, or perhaps work as a domestic." "With what money?" Lena's voice rang out clear from the porch. She stepped forward, and Ethan saw she was holding Mila against her shoulder, her chin high. "I have almost nothing. What I have, I'm saving to go west in the spring. Your boarding house costs $2 a week. Your domestic positions pay 50 cents a day, and no one will hire a woman with a baby. So tell me, Pastor, exactly how your solution is supposed to work." Williams faltered. "I'm sure we could make arrangements." "Arrangements!" Lena's laugh was bitter. "Like the arrangements people made when my husband was beating me and I begged for help? Like the arrangements that told me I should be grateful for a man who gave me his name, even if he used his fists to remind me I was his property?" The men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Henderson's face had gone red. "We don't know anything about that," he said. "We only know what we see now, a woman of loose morals." "Don't." Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet. Don't finish that sentence. Imposing on your kindness and compromising your standing in the community. My standing. Ethan looked at them with something close to contempt. You want to know about my standing? I haven't set foot in your church in 8 years. I haven't attended a single town meeting, social gathering, or community event. I pay my taxes and keep to myself. That's my standing, and it was my choice. Then choose differently now, Morrison urged. Send her away, come back to town, rejoin the community. We'd welcome you back, Ethan. Martha wouldn't want you living like this. And there it was again. Martha's name, wielded like a weapon to make him comply. Don't talk to me about what Martha would want. Ethan's voice shook with suppressed rage. Martha would want me to help someone in need. Martha would want me to stand up to bullies who hide behind propriety and scripture while ignoring basic human decency. And Martha would be ashamed of every one of you for riding out here to harass a woman who's done nothing wrong except survive. Pastor Williams opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked genuinely troubled now, like maybe he was starting to see the situation differently. But Henderson wasn't done. If you won't do the right thing voluntarily, we'll have to take other measures. What measures? Ethan asked flatly. The child. If the mother is unfit, living in sin, exposing the baby to immoral conditions, well, the county has procedures for such situations. The threat hung in the air like poison. Lena made a small sound, clutching Mila tighter, and Ethan saw red. You threatened to take her child, and we're past talking. He took a step forward, and his hand went to where his rifle would have been if he'd thought to bring it. You're on my property. You've stated your business. Now get off my land before I make you leave. Ethan, please. Williams tried once more. Now. The finality in his voice must have convinced them. Morrison and Henderson turned their horses, faces hard with disapproval. Williams lingered a moment longer. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I truly am. But this won't end here. The town's already talking, and once people start talking, let them talk. Ethan met his eyes. I've survived worse than gossip. Williams nodded sadly and turned his horse to follow the others. They rode away in a cloud of snow and judgment, leaving Ethan and Lena standing in the yard. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Lena sank down onto the porch steps, still clutching Mila, and Ethan saw her whole body shaking. They'll take her, she whispered. They'll find a way. They'll say I'm unfit, and they'll take her, and I'll never... Her voice broke. I can't lose her. I can't. Ethan sat down beside her, careful to leave space between them. They won't take her. You heard what he said. The county has procedures for actual unfit mothers, not for women whose only crime is being poor and needing help. He kept his voice steady, sure. You're a good mother, Lena. Anyone with eyes can see that. Mila's healthy, fed, loved. No judge would take her from you. You don't know that. You don't know what men with power can do when they decide a woman doesn't deserve what she has. She was right, and they both knew it. The world was full of stories about children taken from mothers deemed unsuitable, about women punished for failing to conform to society's narrow definitions of acceptable behavior. Then we make sure they can't, Ethan said. We make sure everything is above reproach. Separate sleeping quarters. You're already in your own room. No gossip fodder. We keep our interactions proper when we go to town. And we document everything. Your care for Mila, the improvements in both your conditions. We build a case that you're exactly what you are. A good mother doing her best. Lena turned to look at him, hope and fear warring in her expression. Why are you doing this? You could end all of this by just asking me to leave. Your life would go back to normal. No more judgment, no more threats. My life was never normal. It was just empty. He looked out at the snow-covered fields, the ranch he'd built into a fortress against feeling. And I'm tired, Lena. Tired of being angry. Tired of being alone. Tired of letting fear make my decisions for me. But the town can think whatever they want. I learned a long time ago that you can't control what people think. You can only control what you know to be true. He met her eyes. And I know that helping you is the first right thing I've done in 8 years. I'm not stopping now because some small-minded people can't imagine kindness without ulterior motives. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. "You're a good man, Ethan Cole." "Don't spread that around. It'll ruin my reputation as a mean old bastard." But his voice was gentle, and when Mila reached out a tiny hand toward him, he let her wrap her fingers around his thumb. They sat there on the porch as the sun sank lower, three people against the world's judgment, finding strength in their unlikely alliance. The next Sunday, Ethan made a decision that would either solve everything or destroy what little peace they'd found. He woke Lena before dawn. "Get dressed," he said through her door. "Your good dress, if you have one. We're going to church." He heard her sharp intake of breath. "Ethan, no, that's exactly what they want, to humiliate us in front of everyone." "No, what they want is for us to hide, to act like we're ashamed. We're going to show them we're not." He paused. "You don't have to come. But I'm going, and I'm going to make something very clear to that congregation." 15 minutes later, Lena emerged wearing a dress he'd never seen, simple blue cotton that she must have kept packed away for special occasions. She'd braided her hair and bundled Mila in the warmest blankets they had. "I must be crazy," she muttered, "following you into the lion's den." "Probably, but we'll be crazy together." The ride to town was silent, tension thick between them. When they pulled up to the church, people were already gathering outside, and Ethan felt their stares like physical weight. Conversation stopped. Whispers started. He climbed down from the wagon and held out his hand to help Lena descend. She took it, her grip tight with nerves, and together they walked toward the church entrance. Mrs. Henderson stood there like a sentry, her face pinched with disapproval. "I'm surprised you'd show your face here." "It's the Lord's house," Ethan said evenly. "Last I checked, everyone was welcome." "Everyone who comes in the proper spirit of repentance, perhaps." "Then you should fit right in." He moved past her, Lena at his side, feeling the eyes of the entire town on their backs. Inside, the church went quiet. People turned in their pews, staring openly. Ethan felt Lena start to falter, her steps slowing. "Head up," he murmured. "You've done nothing wrong." They walked down the center aisle together. Ethan chose a pew near the front, not the very front that would be too aggressive, but close enough to make his point. He sat down, and Lena sat beside him, Mila quiet against her shoulder. The whispers rose like water around them. Ethan heard fragments, shameless, improper, that poor baby, and felt Lena flinch with each one. Pastor Williams entered through the side door and stopped short when he saw them. His face went through several expressions before settling on resigned acceptance. He took his place at the pulpit and opened his Bible. "Today's sermon," he began, his voice tight, "was going to be about the importance of maintaining community standards, about the dangers of moral laxity and the need for proper Christian behavior." Ethan felt Lena tense beside him. "But I think instead," Williams continued slowly, like he was working something out as he spoke, "we need to talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan." A murmur ran through the congregation. This wasn't what they'd expected. Williams read the familiar story. The man beaten and left on the road, the priest and Levite who passed by, the Samaritan who stopped to help. His voice grew stronger as he continued. "The point of this parable," he said, looking out at his congregation, "isn't about who the wounded man was or whether he deserved help. It's about who chose to see his humanity and act on it." He paused. "Sometimes the most righteous act is the one that makes us uncomfortable. Sometimes mercy looks improper to those who value appearances over compassion." Mrs. Henderson stood up abruptly. "Pastor Williams, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Martha. I'm stating clearly what Scripture teaches, that we're called to help those in need, not to judge them, that hospitality to strangers is a virtue, not a vice, and that sometimes the people we think have strayed the furthest from righteousness are actually the ones following Christ's teaching most closely." He looked directly at Ethan and Lena then, and something in his expression had shifted, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. "Mr. Cole found a woman and child freezing in his barn. He brought them inside, gave them shelter, asked nothing in return. Some of you see scandal in that. I see the Good Samaritan stopping on a dangerous road to help someone the rest of the world had passed by." The silence in the church was absolute now. People shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with having their judgment reflected back at them. So, before we cast stones, Williams continued softly, maybe we should ask ourselves who we are in this story. Are we the ones offering help, or the ones walking past because it's easier not to get involved? He continued the sermon, but Ethan barely heard it. Beside him, Lena was crying silently, her shoulders shaking. He wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how, didn't want to give the gossips more ammunition. Then he felt her hand slip into his, her fingers cold and trembling. He squeezed gently, a silent reassurance, and kept holding on. After the service, the reactions were mixed. Some people left quickly, avoiding eye contact. Others approached cautiously, and Ethan braced for confrontation. But it was Sarah Mitchell, a widow about Martha's age, who spoke first. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly, "I wanted to say what you did was right, and I'm sorry it's taken the pastor shaming us all to say so." "You don't need to," Ethan started. "Yes, I do." She looked at Lena. "I lost my husband 5 years ago. I know what it's like when people would rather judge than help. If you need anything, anything at all, you come find me." She pressed a small package into Lena's hands and walked away before either of them could respond. Others followed slowly. Not everyone. Mrs. Henderson swept out with her husband in righteous fury, and a good portion of the congregation followed them. But enough stayed, enough offered quiet words of support or just respectful nods. One old farmer named Jack Davidson clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "About time someone stood up to that Henderson woman. She's been ruling this town like her own personal kingdom for too long." "Wasn't trying to stand up to anyone," Ethan said. "Just trying to do right. Same thing sometimes." Davidson tipped his hat to Lena. "Ma'am, you're welcome at my table any time." By the time they made it back to the wagon, Lena was openly crying. Ethan helped her up and drove them home in silence, letting her process whatever was happening inside her. At the ranch, she finally spoke. They listened. Some of them actually listened. Some did. Some won't ever listen. He helped her down. But it's a start. Inside, Lena opened Sarah Mitchell's package. It contained baby clothes, soft, hand-sewn, in sizes Mila would grow into. There was also a small bag of peppermint candy and a note. Lena read it aloud, her voice shaking. "For the baby, and for you, because sometimes we all need something sweet. You're not alone anymore, Sarah." She looked up at Ethan, and the hope in her eyes was almost painful to witness. "Do you think, is it possible that not everyone in the world is cruel?" "Yeah, I think maybe it is." Lena set down the package and impulsively hugged him. Ethan froze, unsure what to do with his hands, his heart pounding. She felt small and solid against him, and he realized this was the first time he'd held another person in 8 years. Slowly, carefully, he returned the embrace. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, "for fighting for us, for not giving up." "Thank you for giving me something to fight for," he said quietly. She pulled back, wiping her eyes, and they stood there in the warm kitchen with winter light streaming through the windows. Something had shifted between them in that church, in that moment of joined hands and shared defiance. The town hadn't fully accepted them. Maybe it never would. But they'd drawn a line together, stood their ground, and found unexpected allies. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Inside, Lena made them lunch while Mila played on a blanket by the fire. Ethan sat in his chair and watched them move through his house, these two people who'd somehow become essential to his carefully constructed solitude. Come spring, they'd leave. That was still the plan. But for the first time since making that agreement, Ethan found himself hoping spring might take its time arriving. Winter deepened around them after that Sunday, but inside the ranch house, something else was growing. The days fell into a rhythm that felt less like an arrangement and more like a life being built from small, careful moments. Lena grew stronger. The hollow places in her cheeks filled out, her hands steadied, and the shadows under her eyes began to fade. She moved through the house with more confidence now, no longer asking permission for every small thing. She rearranged the kitchen to make it more efficient, hung curtains she'd sewn from old fabric she found in the attic, and started a sourdough starter that she tended like a living thing. Mila thrived too. She'd grown plump and rosy, her weak cries replaced by gurgling laughter that filled the house with a sound Ethan had thought he'd never hear again. She was starting to track movement with her eyes, reaching for things that caught her attention, and Ethan found himself doing ridiculous things to make her smile. "You're good with her," Lena said one evening, watching him bounce Mila on his knee while she kneaded bread dough. "Had practice once?" The words came easier now. He could talk about his daughter without feeling like his chest was caving in. "Caroline, she had Martha's eyes and my stubborn chin." What was Martha like? Ethan considered the question. For 8 years, he'd avoided talking about his wife, kept her memory locked away where it couldn't hurt him. But something had shifted, and the words came without the usual crushing weight. Strong, practical. She could birth a calf and bake a pie in the same morning, then sit down and read poetry like it was nothing. He smiled at the memory. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Drove me crazy sometimes, but I loved her for it. She sounds wonderful. She was, and stubborn. She knew the pregnancy was risky. The doctor told us that. But she wanted a baby so badly she wouldn't listen to reason. His voice went quiet. Sometimes I'm angry at her for that. For choosing to risk everything when I would have been content with just her. Lena stopped kneading, her hands still in the dough. And other times? Other times I think about how much joy Caroline brought her in those 2 months. How Martha would hold her and look at me like we'd created a miracle. He adjusted Mila's weight, careful with her delicate frame. Maybe some things are worth the risk, even if they end badly. Or maybe, Lena said softly, they don't end. Maybe they just change into something different. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and something passed between them that neither was quite ready to name. Ethan looked away first, focusing on Mila's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb. The peace lasted another 3 weeks before Thomas Bennett came looking for his wife. Ethan was in the barn when he heard the horse, and something about the way it moved, fast, angry, purposeful, made his gut tighten. He grabbed his rifle this time and stepped outside to see a man dismounting in his yard. Thomas Bennett was everything Ethan had imagined, and worse. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of face that probably looked trustworthy to people who didn't know better. But Ethan saw the rage in his eyes, the way his hands flexed like they were remembering the shape of someone's throat. "You Cole?" Bennett demanded. "I am. You're trespassing. I'm looking for my wife. Been told she might be here." Ethan kept the rifle pointed down but visible. "Don't know anyone by that name." "Lena Bennett, though she might be using her maiden name, Hartley. About this tall dark hair, probably has a baby with her." Bennett's voice dripped contempt. "Baby's not mine, in case you were wondering. She was carrying another man's bastard when I was fool enough to marry her." Every word was calculated to wound, to reduce Lena to something less than human. Ethan felt his finger tighten on the rifle. "Like I said, don't know anyone by that name. Now get off my property." Bennett took a step closer. "Listen, old man. I don't know what story she told you, but she's my legal wife. That means she's my property, and the law's on my side. So either you produce her right now, or I'll get the sheriff and we'll tear this place apart. The law says a wife isn't property anymore. Hasn't for a while now." Ethan raised the rifle just enough to make his point. "And I said, get off my land. You're harboring a fugitive. I'm protecting a woman and child from a man who thinks his fists make him righteous." Ethan's voice went cold and flat. "I've seen the bruises, Bennett. Seen the scars, seen what you did to her, and I'm telling you now, you're not taking her anywhere." Bennett's face flushed dark red. "She's lying. Women like her always lie. Probably showed you some old bruises from falling downstairs. Made up some sob story. Women don't fall downstairs and break their own ribs in 4 places. Don't fall and give themselves finger-shaped bruises around their throats." Ethan took a step forward. "I wasn't born yesterday, and I know exactly what kind of man you are." "You don't know anything." But Bennett's voice had gone defensive, and Ethan knew he'd struck home. "Whatever she told you, she's a liar and a whore who—" The rifle came up smooth and fast, and suddenly it was pointed directly at Bennett's chest. "Choose your next words very carefully," Ethan said quietly, "because I'm about 3 seconds from deciding you're a threat that needs eliminating." They stood frozen like that, 2 men with 8 feet and a world of violence between them. Then the house door opened and Lena stepped onto the porch. "Thomas?" Her voice shook, but she stood tall, Mila clutched against her chest. "You need to leave." Bennett's face transformed when he saw her. Rage and possessiveness and something that might have been relief all twisted together. "Lena, thank the Lord. I've been searching for months. Come here, we're going home." "I don't have a home with you anymore." "Don't be ridiculous. You're my wife. On paper, maybe. But I stopped being your wife the first time you hit me for burning dinner, the 10th time you locked me in the cellar for talking back, the 100th time you reminded me I was lucky you'd taken in another man's bastard." Each word landed like a blow, and Ethan saw Bennett flinch despite himself. But then his face hardened again, that practiced charm sliding back into place. "Lena, honey, I know we've had our troubles, but marriage is work. It's about forgiveness and second chances." He spread his hands, the picture of reasonableness. "Come home. We'll start over. I'll be better, I promise." "You promised that before, after the first black eye, after the cracked rib, after you threw me down the stairs when I was 6 months pregnant." Lena's voice grew stronger with each accusation. "Your promises mean nothing. I was under stress. The mill, the finances, it made me someone I'm not. But I've changed, Lena. I've been going to church, talking to the pastor. I'm a different man now." "No, you're not. You're just the same man who's realized he lost control of his property and wants it back." Bennett's mask slipped, and Ethan saw the monster underneath. "Don't push me, Lena. I've been patient. I've been reasonable. But you're embarrassing me, making me look weak in front of my friends. That stops now. You're coming home. And if you make this difficult, well, accidents happen to people who don't know their place." Ethan had heard enough. He stepped between Bennett and the porch, putting his body as a barrier. "She's not going anywhere with you. You can threaten, you can get the law, you can do whatever makes you feel powerful. But you're not touching her or that baby. Not today, not ever." Bennett looked at him with contempt. "You're making a mistake, old man. This is between me and my wife. Your wife left you. That makes it her choice, not yours. The law? The law says she can file for divorce on grounds of cruelty. The law says those bruises and scars are evidence. The law says a man who beats his wife isn't entitled to her obedience." Ethan's voice was steady as stone. "So you can ride into town and get the sheriff, and we'll lay out every mark you put on her body. We'll tell them about the starvation, the isolation, the threats, and then we'll see whose side the law takes." It was a gamble, and they both knew it. The law was unpredictable when it came to women, especially women who'd left their husbands. But Ethan sold it with such conviction that Bennett hesitated. "This isn't over," he said finally. "You think you can keep her? Good luck. She'll ruin you like she ruins everything. And when you're tired of her and that bastard child, don't come crying to me." He swung back onto his horse, but before he rode off, he looked at Lena one last time. "You're dead to me," he said coldly. "And when you come crawling back, and you will, I won't be there." "Good," Lena said, and her voice didn't shake at all. Bennett spurred his horse and rode off in a spray of snow and fury. Ethan kept the rifle up until he was out of sight, then slowly lowered it. The silence that followed felt like the aftermath of a storm. Ethan turned to find Lena sitting on the porch steps, clutching Mila so tightly the baby squirmed in protest. She was shaking violently, her breath coming in sharp gasps. He set down the rifle and moved to sit beside her, careful not to crowd her. "He's gone," he said quietly. "You're safe. For now. But he'll come back, or he'll send someone, or he'll find a way to—" Her voice spiraled higher, panic taking over. "Lena, look at me." She turned, and he saw raw terror in her eyes, the kind that came from years of learned helplessness. "He can't take you. I won't let him." Ethan kept his voice steady, anchoring. "And you're not the same woman who ran from him 6 months ago. You're stronger now. You've got choices." "What choices? I have no money, no family, nowhere to go." "You've got me." The words hung in the air between them, meaning more than either was ready to acknowledge. Lena stared at him, her breathing slowly calming. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for someone like me?" "Someone like you." Ethan shook his head. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Lena. You walked through November cold with a baby rather than stay somewhere you weren't safe. You rebuilt yourself from nothing. You stood up to him just now even though you were terrified. That's not weakness. That's courage. I don't feel courageous. I feel scared. Courage isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing what needs doing anyway. He risked putting a hand on her shoulder, felt her lean into the touch. And you don't have to do it alone anymore. Lena turned into him then, burying her face against his chest, and the sobs that came were wrenching, years of suppressed fear and pain finally breaking free. Ethan held her, one hand on her back, the other supporting Mila between them, and let her cry out 8 months of running. When she finally quieted, she pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry. I got your shirt all wet." "Shirt's dry. You needed that." "I needed a lot of things." She looked at Mila, who'd fallen asleep despite the drama. "I needed to believe someone could be kind without wanting something in return. I needed to see what a good man looks like. I needed—" She stopped, something shifting in her expression. "I needed you." The admission hung between them, more honest than either had dared to be. Ethan felt something in his chest crack wider, that frozen place where he'd buried hope 8 years ago. "Lena, I know we said spring. I know the arrangement was temporary." She met his eyes directly. "But I don't want temporary anymore. I don't want to keep running. I want—" She trailed off, and Ethan saw fear war with hope in her face. He understood. Wanting something after you'd learned that wanting led to loss was terrifying. "What do you want?" he asked gently. "I want to stay. Not as a guest, not as help. I want to build something here. With you." She rushed on before he could respond. "I know you loved Martha. I'm not trying to replace her or pretend what we have is the same, but whatever this is between us, this partnership, this friendship, it matters to me. You matter to me." Ethan sat very still, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. For 8 years, he told himself he was done with caring, done with hoping, done with anything that could hurt him. But Lena and Mila had crept past his defenses anyway, filling his empty house with life and laughter and the possibility of a future. "I care about you too," he said, the words rusty from disuse but true. "Both of you. More than I thought I could care about anything again." "Then let me stay. Not until spring, longer. Let us be a family, whatever that looks like." A family. The word terrified him and tempted him in equal measure. He thought about Martha, about Caroline, about the family he'd lost and the hole they'd left behind. Then he thought about Lena singing to Mila in the evenings, about shared meals and easy conversation, about the way his house felt alive again. "There's still the problem of the town," he said slowly, "and Thomas, and the fact that you're legally married to a man who won't let you go easily. I'll file for divorce, cruelty and abandonment, like you said. It might take time, and until then, we'd still be living under one roof. Still giving people ammunition." Lena's face fell. "I understand if you don't want the scandal. I don't give a damn about scandal." Ethan stopped her before she could spiral. "But I care about you and Mila being safe and protected legally. So if we're doing this, we do it right." "What does that mean?" Ethan took a breath, feeling like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "It means we get married." Lena's eyes went wide. "What?" "A legal marriage, real in the eyes of the law and the town. It would protect you from Thomas. He can't claim you as his wife if you're legally married to someone else. It would stop the gossip. And it would give Mila my name, which means protection and legitimacy." "Ethan, you don't have to sacrifice yourself." "This isn't sacrifice." He caught her hand, held it between both of his. "Lena, somewhere between finding you in my barn and watching you face down your demons on this porch, I started caring whether I lived or died again. Started wanting tomorrow instead of just enduring it. That's not sacrifice. That's grace I don't deserve, but I'm selfish enough to want anyway." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I can't give you what Martha gave you. I can't replace her." "I don't want you to replace her. I want you to be exactly who you are." He squeezed her hand gently. "This wouldn't be the same as what I had with Martha. It would be different, quieter maybe, built on friendship instead of passion. But it would be real, and it would be ours. You'd really do that? Marry me knowing I come with baggage and a baby and a vengeful ex-husband? I'd be honored to. And he meant it, this gruff man who'd thought his capacity for love had died with his wife and daughter. If you'll have a stubborn old widower who's forgotten how to talk to people and makes terrible coffee. Lena laughed through her tears. Your coffee's gotten better. That's all you. Everything good in this house is because of you. She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for doubt or obligation or pity. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. Okay. Okay? Okay, I'll marry you, Ethan Cole. She was smiling now, real and wide and beautiful. But I have conditions. Name them. We tell the truth, to the pastor, to the town, to each other. This is about partnership and protection, not romance. I won't pretend we're a love match when we're really just two broken people trying to build something functional. Agreed. What else? Separate bedrooms. I would never expect that. Ethan's voice was firm. Whatever this marriage is, it's on your terms. Always. And if someday you meet someone you actually love, someone who can give you a real marriage, then I'll be grateful I found friendship with you in the meantime. But Lena, I'm 43 years old and twice broken. I'm not looking for grand passion. I'm looking for peace. And I found more peace with you in 3 months than I had in 8 years alone. She studied him, then nodded. When? Soon, before Thomas has time to make trouble or the town gossips work themselves into a frenzy. He stood, pulling her up with him. I'll ride to town tomorrow, talk to Pastor Williams. He owes us after that sermon. What if he won't do it? Then we'll find someone who will. Justice of the peace, traveling minister, doesn't matter. One way or another, you're going to be Lena Cole, and Thomas Bennett won't have any legal claim on you or Mila. Lena set Mila down in her basket and turned back to Ethan. Then, in a gesture that surprised them both, she stepped forward and kissed his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me, for believing me, for giving us a home. Ethan's hand came up to touch where her lips had been, his heart doing strange things in his chest. Thank you for bringing life back into this house, for reminding me what it feels like to hope. They stood close in the fading afternoon light, two damaged people who'd found each other by accident and chosen each other on purpose. Outside, winter still raged, but inside, in that small, warm kitchen with a sleeping baby and shared purpose, spring was already beginning to bloom. That night, Ethan lay awake in his bed and thought about the vows he'd make in a few days. He'd meant what he said about friendship and partnership, about not expecting romance or passion, but lying there in the dark, listening to Lena move around upstairs, he couldn't quite ignore the flutter in his chest when he thought about her becoming his wife. Not a replacement for Martha. Something different, something unexpected. A second chance at family, at purpose, at believing the future might hold something besides empty rooms and old grief. He thought Martha would approve. She'd always said his stubbornness would keep him alive, but his isolation would kill him. She'd want him to live again. To let someone in. To choose hope over safety. Upstairs, Lena's voice drifted down, singing to Mila, that same melody she sang every night. Ethan closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. In 3 days, they'd stand before Pastor Williams and make promises to each other. Legal promises, practical ones, built on mutual need and respect rather than love. But as Ethan drifted toward sleep, he wondered if maybe, given time, those practical promises might grow into something deeper. Not the same as what he'd lost, but valuable in its own right. A marriage of convenience that might, against all odds, turn into something like home. Pastor Williams agreed to marry them, though his expression suggested he thought they were both out of their minds. You understand what you're doing? He asked Ethan when he rode into town the next morning. They stood in the church office, away from prying eyes and eager ears. Marriage isn't something to enter into lightly, especially not as a solution to social pressure. I'm not entering into it lightly. Ethan kept his voice steady. And it's not about social pressure. It's about doing right by a woman who needs protection and a child who deserves a name. Ethan, there are other ways. Name one that actually works, that gives Lena legal standing against Thomas Bennett. that protects Mila from being taken by county authorities or bounty hunters. He leaned forward. You preached about the Good Samaritan. Well, this is me stopping on the road. This is me choosing to help instead of walking past. William sighed, rubbing his temples. The town will talk. The town's already talking. At least this way they'll have something concrete to talk about instead of making up lies. Ethan's voice softened slightly. Pastor, I know this looks strange from the outside, but Lena and I understand each other. We're both broken people who've found a way to function together. That's more than a lot of marriages have. And you're certain this is what you want? Not obligation, not guilt? Actually want? Ethan thought about his house before Lena arrived, about the silence that had felt like suffocation, about days that blurred into meaningless repetition. Then he thought about coffee made right, about Mila's laughter, about someone to talk to in the evenings who understood grief because she carried her own. I'm certain, he said. William studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. When? This Saturday, quietly. Just Lena, me, Mila, and whoever you need for witnesses. I'll need 2 witnesses. I'll ask Sarah Mitchell. She's been asking about Lena. And maybe Jack Davidson. He's not one for gossip. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Williams moved to his desk, pulling out the necessary papers. Thomas Bennett isn't going to take this well. You need to be prepared for that. I am. Are you? The pastor looked at him seriously. Because men like Bennett don't let go easily. They see women as possessions, and when someone takes what they think belongs to them, let him come. Ethan's voice went cold. I've been preparing for 8 years to not care whether I live or die. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. But he's not touching Lena or that baby. Williams nodded, recognizing the truth in Ethan's eyes. Saturday then, 10 o'clock. And Ethan? I hope this works out the way you're hoping. You've been alone too long. Ethan rode home with the date set, his mind already moving through logistics. They'd need to file the marriage certificate quickly, get it registered before Thomas could interfere. They'd need witnesses who'd testify to Lena's injuries if it came to that. They'd need to be smart and careful and ready for whatever came next. When he got back to the ranch, he found Lena in the kitchen with flour dusted across her cheek, kneading dough while Mila watched from her basket. The domestic scene hit him with unexpected force. This was going to be his life now, officially and legally. This woman, this child, this quiet partnership built on mutual survival. It's set, he said. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. Lena's hand stilled in the dough. That soon? No point waiting. Gives Thomas less time to cause trouble. She nodded, but he saw anxiety flicker across her face. Ethan, are you sure? Really sure? Because once we do this, you can't... There's no going back to how things were. I don't want to go back. He moved closer, careful not to crowd her. Lena, I've spent 8 years going backward, living in the past, treating every day like something to survive instead of live. You changed that. And yeah, maybe this isn't a conventional marriage. Maybe it's not what either of us imagined when we were young. But it's real and it's ours, and that's enough for me. Tears welled in her eyes. I wish I could give you more. I wish I could be... You're exactly what you need to be. He reached out and gently wiped the flour from her cheek. Stop wishing you were something else. I'm not. She caught his hand, held it against her face for a moment. I'll try to be a good wife. And I'll try to be a decent husband. We'll figure it out as we go. The next few days passed in a strange limbo of preparation and anticipation. Lena altered one of Martha's old dresses, pale green cotton that fit her better after months of good meals. She did it with Ethan's permission, and he found he didn't mind. Martha would have wanted her clothes to be useful instead of gathering dust in a trunk. Ethan cleaned himself up, got his hair cut in town despite the stares and whispers, and retrieved his good suit from the back of the closet. It still fit, though it smelled like cedar and old memories. Sarah Mitchell came by on Friday afternoon with a bouquet of dried flowers and a knowing smile. I'm glad you're doing this, she told Ethan while Lena was upstairs with Mila. That girl needs protection, and you need purpose. It's a good match, unconventional as it is. You're not scandalized? Honey, I'm 63 years old and I've buried 2 husbands. I'm past being scandalized by anything that doesn't hurt anybody. She arranged the flowers in a vase. Besides, I've seen the way you look at her when you think no one's watching. Maybe it started as charity, but it's becoming something else. Sarah, don't worry. I'm not expecting declarations of love. Just saying that sometimes the best marriages grow slow instead of starting hot. You two have a foundation. That's more than most people get. Ethan couldn't argue with that, so he didn't try. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, the sky that particular shade of blue that only came in deep winter. Ethan woke early, nerves jumping in his stomach like he was 20 years old again instead of 43. He dressed carefully, fumbling with his tie until he finally got it straight. Downstairs, he found Lena already awake, sitting at the table with Mila. She'd done something different with her hair, braiding it and coiling it at the base of her neck in a style that made her look older, more dignified. The green dress fit her perfectly, bringing out the color in her eyes. "You look beautiful," he said, and meant it. She blushed. "You clean up pretty well yourself. I wasn't sure you owned anything besides work clothes." Had to break out the formal wear for special occasions. He poured coffee, his hands steadier than he expected. "You ready for this?" Terrified, actually, but ready. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "What if Thomas shows up? What if he tries to stop it? Then we'll deal with it. Together." Ethan sat down across from her. "Lena, whatever happens today, you're not alone anymore. You understand that?" "I'm starting to." They drove to town in the wagon, Mila bundled between them, the silence comfortable rather than tense. A few people stared as they passed, but Ethan kept his eyes forward, focused on the church spire rising against the winter sky. Pastor Williams was waiting outside with Sarah Mitchell and Jack Davidson. Both witnesses smiled when they saw the couple approaching, and Sarah immediately moved to fuss over Mila. "Let's get you two married before the gossips figure out what's happening," Williams said with a small smile. Inside, quickly now. The church was empty and quiet, light streaming through the windows in pale shafts. Ethan had been married here before to Martha on a summer day filled with flowers and friends. This was different, stark and simple, and honest in a way that felt right. They stood before the altar, Lena holding Mila while Sarah and Jack flanked them as witnesses. Williams opened his Bible, but before he could begin, the church door crashed open. Thomas Bennett strode in, fury radiating from every line of his body. "Stop this! Stop this right now!" Ethan stepped in front of Lena, his hand instinctively moving to where his gun would be if he'd worn it to church. "You're not welcome here, Bennett. That's my wife you're trying to marry, my legal wife, in case you've forgotten." Thomas moved down the aisle, his voice rising. "This is bigamy, Pastor. You perform this ceremony, you're breaking the law." William stood firm. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett filed papers for divorce 3 days ago on grounds of cruelty and abandonment. Until the divorce is finalized, she has the right to seek legal protection, which includes this marriage." "Papers? What papers?" Thomas turned on Lena. "You filed for divorce?" "Yes." Lena's voice shook but held. "I should have done it months ago." "You ungrateful!" Thomas started forward, but Ethan moved to block him. "That's close enough. Get out of my way, old man. This is between me and my wife." "She's not your wife anymore. Not in any way that matters." Thomas's face went red. "I gave her everything. A home, a name, forgiveness for her bastard. You gave her bruises and starvation and fear." Ethan's voice cut like steel. "You beat her, degraded her, made her feel like she was less than human. That's not marriage. That's ownership, and it's over. The law says a man can't beat his wife. The law says cruelty is grounds for divorce. The law says she has rights, whether you like it or not." Ethan took a step forward. "Now you can leave voluntarily, or Jack here can help you leave. Your choice." Jack Davidson moved to stand beside Ethan, and despite being in his 60s, he was built like a bear, and twice as mean when provoked. Thomas looked between them, calculating. Then his eyes landed on Lena again, and his expression turned cruel. "Fine, marry him. But when he realizes what you are, a used-up whore with another man's bastard, don't come crying to me." He pointed at Mila. And that baby? She'll grow up knowing her mother was too weak to make a marriage work. She'll grow up with the stain of your failure. Lena flinched, and Ethan saw her starting to crumble under the familiar abuse. But then something changed in her face. She straightened, lifted her chin, and looked Thomas directly in the eye. No, she said clearly. Mila will grow up knowing her mother was strong enough to leave a man who hurt her. She'll grow up seeing what a real partnership looks like, built on respect and kindness instead of fear, and she'll never ever think that love is supposed to hurt. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. His face contorted with rage, and for a moment Ethan thought he might actually attack. But William stepped forward, his voice carrying unexpected authority. Mr. Bennett, you will leave this church immediately. If you ever threaten this woman or her child again, I will personally testify to your character in divorce proceedings. Do I make myself clear? Thomas stared at the pastor, clearly not expecting resistance from that quarter. You're making a mistake, all of you. The only mistake was made 8 months ago when Lena married you thinking you were a decent man. Williams gestured to the door. Go, now! Thomas looked around at the faces arrayed against him. Ethan's cold fury, Jack's solid presence, Sarah's protective stance near Mila, Williams's unexpected steel. He was outnumbered and outmatched, and he knew it. This isn't over, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, it is. Lena's voice was steady now. It's been over since the day I walked away. I was just too scared to admit it, but I'm not scared anymore. Thomas looked at her one last time, and something in him seemed to break. The rage drained away, leaving only a bitter, smaller man behind. You'll regret this, he said quietly. All of you. He turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the empty church. They waited in tense silence until the door closed behind him, until they heard his horse galloping away. Sarah let out a breath. Well, that was dramatic. Lena started shaking, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her weak. Ethan caught her elbow, steadying her. You all right? I stood up to him. She looked up at Ethan with wonder. I actually stood up to him and he left. You were amazing. Ethan squeezed her hand. Fierce and brave and exactly what Mila needed to see. What we all needed to see, Sarah added. That man's been terrorizing you for too long. About time someone told him where to get off. Williams cleared his throat. Shall we continue, before anyone else decides to interrupt? Ethan and Lena turned back to the altar, and this time when they faced each other, something had shifted. They'd stood together against Thomas, proved that their partnership was real and worth defending. Whatever happened next, they'd face it as a team. Williams began the ceremony, his voice steady and sure. The traditional words felt both strange and right: love, honor, cherish. Ethan and Lena had agreed on friendship and partnership, but standing here making vows, he found himself meaning them more deeply than expected. Do you, Ethan Cole, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health? Until death do you part? Ethan looked at Lena, this fierce, broken, beautiful woman who'd stumbled into his barn and changed everything. I do. And do you, Lena Hartley Bennett, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Lena's eyes were bright with tears, but her voice was clear. I do. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. William smiled. Ethan, you may kiss your bride. They looked at each other, suddenly awkward. They hadn't discussed this part, but Ethan leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, a promise of protection and partnership. Lena's hand came up to rest over his heart, and in that moment they were sealed together in the eyes of the law and their small community of witnesses. Sarah immediately swept Lena into a hug, while Jack shook Ethan's hand with a grip that could crush stone. Congratulations, he rumbled. You got yourself a good woman there. I know. Williams produced the marriage certificate, and they signed it with witnesses present, concrete, legal proof that Lena was now Lena Cole, protected under Ethan's name and beyond Thomas Bennett's reach. As they left the church, Sarah pressed a basket into Lena's hands. Wedding present, Nothing fancy, just some preserves and bread, but every marriage should start with something sweet. Thank you, Lena whispered, for everything, for believing in us. Honey, I believe in second chances. You too deserve yours. Sarah kissed both her cheeks. Now go home and start your life together. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing what had just happened. They were married, legally, officially, irrevocably bound together. It should have felt terrifying, but instead Ethan felt a strange peace settling over him. Thank you, Lena said finally, for standing up to Thomas, for not backing down. You're the one who stood up to him. I was just backup. Still, I couldn't have done it without you. She shifted Mila in her arms. Did you mean them? The vows? Ethan considered the question honestly. When I married Martha, I meant them with the passion of a young man who thought love conquered everything. This time, he paused, searching for the right words. This time I mean them with the understanding of a man who knows life is hard and love is complicated, but partnership and respect can build something just as strong. That's a good answer. It's an honest one. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Ethan helped Lena down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood together looking at the house that was now officially theirs. Home, Lena said softly. Home, Ethan agreed. Inside, Lena opened Sarah's basket and laughed. Along with the preserves and bread, there was a bottle of wine and a note that said, "For celebrating new beginnings." They shared a quiet dinner, toasting with wine and talking about practical things, filing the certificate, informing the county, making sure everything was properly documented. But underneath the practicality, something warmer was growing. After Lena put Mila to bed, she came back downstairs and found Ethan sitting by the fire. Can I join you? It's your house too now. She sat in the chair across from him, and they watched the flames in comfortable silence. Finally, Lena spoke. I know we said separate bedrooms. I know we agreed this was about partnership, not romance, but Ethan, she paused, gathering courage. I want you to know that I'm grateful for you. And if someday, maybe, if we wanted to try being more than just partners. She trailed off, blushing, and Ethan felt his heart do that strange flutter again. Let's take it slow, he said gently. We've got time now. No deadlines, no pressure. Let's just see what grows naturally. Relief and something that might have been disappointment crossed her face. You're right. Of course you're right. But Lena, he leaned forward. I'm not opposed to the idea. When we're both ready, when it feels right instead of obligatory. Her smile was like sunrise. When it feels right, I can work with that. Winter slowly gave way to early spring. The snow began to melt, revealing brown earth and the first green shoots of new growth. Thomas never came back. Word filtered through town that he'd left Wyoming entirely, headed east to start over somewhere his failures weren't common knowledge. The divorce papers were finalized in March, and Lena's marriage to Ethan was registered without contest. She was officially, legally, completely free. As the days grew longer and warmer, life at the ranch settled into new rhythms. Lena proved herself a natural with the animals, strong and capable despite her initial fears. Mila grew plump and happy, starting to crawl, and then pulling herself up on furniture, always reaching for Ethan when he came into her room. And slowly, carefully, Ethan and Lena grew closer. It started with small things, hands brushing when they passed dishes at dinner, Lena resting her head on his shoulder while they watched Mila play, Ethan's arm around her waist when they stood together watching the sunset. One evening in late April, nearly a year after she'd first appeared in his barn, Lena found Ethan working on the porch. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The wagon trains will be leaving soon, she said, for Oregon and California. They will. We could go if you wanted. Start fresh somewhere new. Ethan set down his tools and looked at her. Is that what you want? I used to think so. I thought running far enough would make me safe. She laced her fingers through his. But I realized I don't need to run anymore. I'm already home. Yeah, Ethan agreed, squeezing her hand. You are. Besides, she added with a smile, someone needs to keep you from making terrible coffee. He laughed, the sound coming easier now than it had in years. Practical, as always. One of us has to be. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Thank you, Ethan, for saving us, for giving us a home, for being patient while I learned to trust again. Thank you for teaching me that life isn't over just because you've lost everything once, that second chances are possible if you're brave enough to take them. They sat together as the sun set, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant colors. Inside the house, Mila was singing to herself in the nonsense language of babies, and the sound drifted out to them on the warm breeze. Papa! The word came clear and distinct, and Ethan's breath caught. Did she just... She's been practicing all week. Lena smiled up at him. I wanted it to be a surprise. Ethan stood and moved to the door where Mila was pulling herself up on the furniture, her face lit with triumph. When she saw him, she reached out her arms. Papa! He picked her up, holding her close, and felt something in his chest that had been frozen for 8 years finally, completely thaw. This child wasn't his by blood, but she was his in every way that mattered. This woman standing beside him wasn't the love of his youth, but she was his partner, his friend, his second chance at believing in tomorrow. Papa? Mila said again, patting his cheek with her small hand. That's right, sweetheart. His voice was rough with emotion. I'm your papa, and you're my girl, and we're a family. Lena wrapped her arms around both of them, and they stood together in the doorway of their home, a widower who'd learned to hope, a runaway who'd learned to stand, and a baby who'd never known she was anything but wanted. Outside, spring was transforming the landscape from barren to beautiful. Inside, a family built from broken pieces and second chances was doing the same thing, growing, healing, becoming something whole. Ethan looked at his wife and daughter, at the life they'd built from nothing but determination and grace, and felt grateful in a way he'd thought impossible 8 years ago. They were home, completely, finally, irrevocably home. And for the first time since losing Martha and Caroline, Ethan looked toward the future and saw not emptiness, but possibility. Tomorrow might bring challenges, but they'd face them together. The town might never fully accept their unconventional beginning, but they had each other and a small circle of true friends. That Thanksgiving, when Lena set 3 plates on the table and Ethan said grace over the food, he meant every word. Grateful for second chances. Grateful for the woman who'd stumbled into his barn and refused to let him stay frozen. Grateful for the child who called him Papa and reminded him daily what love looked like. The barn that had once held only cold and hay now stood as a monument to transformation. The place where everything had started to change, where a desperate woman had sought shelter and found a home, where a grief-locked man had made a choice that would save not just her life, but his own. They weren't a perfect family, but they were real, built on honesty and hard work and the daily choice to show up for each other. And in the end, that was better than perfect. It was everything.